All right, welcome in everybody, deep divers. We are ready to go deep today on a topic I know so many of you are fascinated by, the samurai of Japan.
Buckle up, everyone. We've got a lot of ground to cover.
We do, and thankfully we've got a fantastic guide to help us along the way. Japan, the Ultimate Samurai Guide. An insider looks at the Japanese martial arts, published by Tuttle Publishing.
Excellent resource. It really gets into, not just the history of the samurai, but also how that history connects to, like, the evolution of martial arts in Japan.
Right, right. I mean, I think a lot of times, and I know I've been guilty of this, you kind of picture the samurai and you think, oh yeah, cool swords, awesome armor. But there's so much more to it. Like, how did these warriors become so powerful, so influential in Japanese history, And, like, what can we still see of them today?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. It's easy to get caught up in that romanticized image.
Yeah.
The noble warrior, the unwavering code of honor.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is much more complex,
Oh,
isn't
yeah.
it? And this book really pushes us to, like, dig a little deeper. It challenges that notion of a direct line from, like, the ancient samurai to, modern Japanese people. There's no, like, inherited samurai spirit. Like,
Right.
it's about understanding the historical context.
Okay, so, like, practically speaking, who were the samurai? I mean, they're elite warriors.
Exactly. They were the warrior elite, and they ended up ruling Japan for a long time, like hundreds of years.
Yeah.
From, let's see, the late 12th century until the Meiji Restoration in 1868.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. And their image, even though it's, centuries old at this point, it's still so powerful, so symbolic in Japan.
So to understand where they came from, our book takes us all the way back to the Heian period, and that's 794 to 1185. And what's interesting is that the samurai emerged because, well, the nobles in Kyoto, who were like the big shots at the time, they didn't really want to deal with managing their lands out in the provinces. Can you blame them?
Not really. I mean, imagine you're a nobleman in Kyoto. You're living the good life. Courtly intrigue, poetry readings, fancy ceremonies.
Yeah, sounds nice.
And then, you have to go out and collect taxes from some, like, grumpy farmers. Not exactly appealing.
So they found people to do it for them.
Basically. Young noblemen, maybe those who weren't, top of the line in Kyoto, they saw an opportunity. Go east, manage these estates, develop new territories, keep things in order. It was a chance to make a name for themselves,
Okay.
And around the same time, something else was happening. Military power was becoming more and more privatized. Instead of a strong central army, you had powerful figures, retired emperors, religious institutions building their own private armies.
So less about a central government controlling everything.
Right. More like a web of, like, powerful families and institutions, each with their own, security forces. And this decentralization is really important because it kind of paved the way for the samurai to become the dominant force. That power vacuum, someone had to fill it.
And two clans rose to the challenge, the Taira and the Minamoto. They're sometimes called the Heike and Genji, by the way, just to make things more confusing.
Yeah, they both claim descent from the imperial family. The Minamoto from Emperor Seiwa and the Taira from Emperor Kamu. And they both set up shop in the Kanto region, which is where Tokyo is today.
So they're connected to the imperial family, but they're kind of doing their own thing out east.
Exactly. And at first, the Minamoto had the upper hand, at least in Kyoto. They had these strong ties to the Fujiwara nobles who were, like, super powerful at court.
Gotcha.
But, as you might imagine, these two powerful clans, they eventually clashed. Big time. And that clash is known as the Genpei War. It was a brutal, decades-long conflict that reshaped Japan.
It went on for decades.
Yeah, from 1180 to 1185. It all started with, well, a power struggle in the imperial court. Taira no Kiyomori, he was the head of the Taira clan, and he was pretty much running the show. He managed to install his infant grandson as Emperor Antoku.
An infant.
Yeah, bold move, right. But this really ticked off Prince Mochihito, who, also had a claim to the throne.
So he wasn't happy about being passed over for a baby.
Not at all. So he called on the Minamoto clan for help, and that's when Minamoto no Yoritomo stepped up. He was basically itching for revenge against the Taira anyway. The war was brutal, with both sides committing some pretty questionable acts.
This is where we get those classic samurai stories, right?
Some of them, yeah. The Genpei War is full of, like, larger-than-life characters, dramatic battles, and, of course, tragedy. The final battle was at Denora, a naval battle. And it was a decisive victory for the Minamoto, but it also had this really, like, heart-wrenching scene where Emperor Antoku's grandmother, Taira no Tokiko, jumped into the sea with the young emperor rather than be captured.
Oh.
It really shows, just how high the stakes were.
So after the Minamoto won, Yoritomo, he didn't waste any time. She established the first warrior government, the Bakufu, in Kamakura, and that's in 1185, which marks the start of the Kamakura shogunate.
It's interesting, though, because he didn't try to completely replace the imperial court in Kyoto. It was more like a dual system. The emperor and the court, they stayed in Kyoto, but the real power, and especially the military power, was in Kamakura.
A government within a government, basically.
Exactly. And Yoritomo, he was officially recognized as the Seitai Shogun, which basically means commander-in-chief against the barbarians. It was a title with a lot of historical weight. He was smart. He used the emperor's legitimacy to, boost his own authority.
And under his rule, the samurai way of life really started to solidify.
Absolutely. Yoritomo, he laid the groundwork for centuries of samurai rule. He established all these rules, these obligations that tied warriors to their lord. It was like the beginning of the feudal system. And he was also like a key figure in developing the samurai code of honor, loyalty, bravery, self-discipline, all that.
So he rewards his loyal followers with land and official positions, and this whole warrior culture, it's distinct from the courtly life in Kyoto, right?
Yeah, definitely. It was rougher, more martial. Life in Kamakura wasn't about poetry readings. It was about, being a warrior, being ready for battle.
But it's never that simple, right? Because Yoritomo's younger brother, Yoshitsune, he was a major player in the Junpei War. He's kind of like the tragic hero of the story.
Yeah, Yoshitsune. He was probably Yoritomo's most talented general, the one who actually led them to a lot of those key victories. But, his popularity and his success, they kind of backfired.
Really?
Yeah, it's classic sibling rivalry, but on a huge scale.
Yeah.
Yoritomo, he started to get suspicious, jealous. He thought Yoshitsune might be trying to take over. There were rumors, people whispering in Yoritomo's ear, and things just spiraled from there.
I've even heard that Yoshitsune was supposedly trained by mythical creatures called Tengu while he was in exile as a kid.
Right. There are all these legends about him. It's like even back then, people were drawn to this idea of the tragic hero.
So what happened to him?
Well, let's just say it didn't end well. Yoritomo declared him a traitor, had him hunted down. He was forced to commit suicide.
That's sad.
Yeah. It's a real tragedy. And, even after his death, there was this, lingering sympathy for him. The term Hogenbiki means sympathy for Yoshitsune. It's still used today to describe rooting for the underdog.
Wow. Okay. So the Kamakura shogunate, it lasted for about 150 years, right? But it wasn't all smooth sailing. They even had to fight off the Mongols twice.
Right. The Mongol invasions. That's a whole other story. But yeah, they repelled the Mongols, which is pretty impressive. But eventually the Kamakura shogunate, it crumbled.
What happened?
There was a combination of things, I think. Internal power struggles, economic problems. And then you had Emperor Go-Daigo, who decided he wanted to restore imperial power.
Okay.
He actually managed to get some powerful figures on his side, like Ashikaga Takauji and Nida Yoshisada. They were both key figures in the shogunate.
So the emperor, he's trying to take back control from the samurai?
Exactly. And for a while, it looked like he might actually succeed. But then things got, complicated.
Of course they did.
Ashikaga Takauji, he'd been tasked with, putting down the emperor's loyalists, but he ended up switching sides.
He betrayed the shogunate.
Yeah. And then Nida Yoshisada, who was supposed to fight Takauji, he also decided to do his own thing.
Wow, so everybody's fighting everybody.
Pretty much. And to make a long story short, Ashikaga Takauji, he ended up seizing power himself. He established the Muromachi shogunate in Kyoto in 1336.
Okay, so we're back in Kyoto, but the samurai are still in charge.
Exactly. But it's a different kind of samurai rule now. They're in the capital, surrounded by the imperial court, the aristocracy.
They're having to, learn how to be fancy now.
In a way, yeah. They had to adapt. And this actually led to a really interesting period of, cultural blending. The Muromachi period, it's also known as the Ashikaga period, and it's this time when the samurai, they start to embrace the arts, things like the tea ceremony, theater, poetry.
They're becoming more refined, less war-focused.
Yeah, I think so. They still valued their martial skills, of course, but there was this growing emphasis on etiquette, on proper conduct. They started creating these things called house codes, or kakun.
What were those?
They were basically family documents. They would advise samurai on things like how to dress, how to behave around their superiors, how to handle their weapons. It was all about, becoming a more well-rounded, cultivated warrior.
Okay, so the Muromachi period, it's like a time of peace and culture.
It was relatively peaceful, yeah,
Hmm.
at least for a while.
But of course, it couldn't last forever, right?
Sadly, no. You know how it goes. Power struggles, succession disputes.
So what happened? Another war.
In a way, yeah. It started with this, a family squabble. The 8th shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimasa, he got into a big fight with his wife, Tomiko. It was about who would inherit the shogunate.
A family feud starts a war. Sounds familiar.
Right. But this one was a doozy. It's called the Onin War, and it lasted for 10 years, from 1467 to 1477.
Okay, so what happened?
Well, different factions started taking sides, and pretty soon the whole country was embroiled in this conflict. It was brutal. Kyoto, the capital, was practically destroyed.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a disaster. And the Onin War, it basically marked the beginning of the Warring States period, or Sengoku period.
Which lasted for, like, a century.
Yeah, give or take.
Yeah.
From 1467 to around 1603, it was a crazy time. Japan was divided into all these independent domains, each ruled by a daimyo.
Daimyo.
Yeah, it's a great name. They were basically like warlords. And they were constantly fighting each other, forming alliances, breaking alliances. It was chaos.
This sounds intense.
It was. And it actually led to some pretty big changes in how wars were fought. Before this, it was mostly about individual samurai combat. But during the Sengoku period, armies got much bigger.
They had to, right?
Exactly. They started using peasant conscripts, called ashigaru, as foot soldiers.
Peasants.
Yeah. They weren't samurai, but they were trained to fight in formations using spears, called yari. And this is a big one, firearms.
Guns. The samurai used guns.
Yeah, well, not all of them. But firearms were introduced to Japan by the Portuguese in the mid-16th century, and they quickly changed the game.
So you have these huge armies of peasants armed with spears and guns.
Pretty much. And it made warfare a lot more brutal, a lot more destructive.
I bet.
But out of this chaos, 3 really powerful daimyo emerged. They're the ones who started to put Japan back together. Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu.
Okay, so these guys are the big players who end the Warring States, period.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
They each played a key role in unifying Japan, though they all had very different approaches.
All right, let's start with Oda Nobunaga. Our book calls him a ruthless strategist, which, I mean, that's putting it mildly, right?
Yeah, he was not afraid to use force. He brought a lot of those independent daimyo under his control. By the time he was assassinated, he was in control of like a third of Japan.
He got that far.
He was close. And he was a real innovator, militarily speaking. He embraced new technologies, like he's a big fan of firearms. And he wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo. He even went after the Buddhist monasteries, which were very powerful at the time.
He went after the Buddhist monasteries. Why?
Well, they were powerful. They had a lot of influence. And some of them were, shall we say, a little too involved in politics. Nobunaga saw them as a threat. And he wasn't shy about dealing with threats.
And how did he deal with them?
Let's just say he wasn't known for his subtlety. One of the most famous examples is the burning of Enryakuji Temple. It was a major Buddhist center, and Nobunaga had his troops burn it to the ground.
That's crazy.
Yeah, he was definitely a force to be reckoned with. But he also had his enemies, and in 1582, he was assassinated by one of his own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide.
Betrayed by his own guy.
Right. And historians are still debating why Mitsuhide did it. Some say it was personal. Some say he was trying to seize power for himself. Some even think there was a conspiracy involving other powerful figures.
That's a real historical mystery, isn't it?
It is. And it just goes to show, even when you're at the top, it can all come crashing down in an instant.
And speaking of powerful figures, the book mentions this motto, Furin Kazan. It means wind, forest, fire, mountain. It sounds like something Nobunaga would use.
Actually, it was the motto of one of his greatest rivals, Takeda Shingen.
Ah, okay.
He was another powerful daimyo during the Warring States period. And that motto, it's from The Art of War by Sun Tzu. Be adaptable like the wind, silent like the forest, fierce like fire, and unmovable like a mountain.
I like it.
Yeah, it's pretty badass.
So Nobunaga's assassinated. What happens next?
Well, his right-hand man, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, he steps in. And Hideyoshi, he was a fascinating guy.
In what way?
Well, for one thing, he was born a peasant. No noble lineage, no claim to any fancy titles.
And he rose to power.
He did. He was incredibly ambitious, a brilliant strategist, and let's just say he knew how to play the game of politics. He managed to consolidate power after Nobunaga's death, and he actually succeeded in unifying Japan.
He finished what Nobunaga started.
He did. He brought all the remaining daimyo under his control, and he implemented a lot of important policies, like he was the one who instituted the sword hunt.
What was that?
Basically, he wanted to disarm the peasants. It was a way to, solidify the samurai class as the only ones allowed to carry weapons. It was part of his strategy to create a more stable, unified society.
Interesting. So Hideyoshi, he unifies Japan. What else is there to tell?
Well, he also had this, I guess you could say, a darker side. He was very suspicious of Christianity, and he actually forced Sen no Rikyu, the famous tea master, to commit suicide.
Why would he do that?
The reasons aren't totally clear. It might have been paranoia, political maneuvering, maybe even a personal grudge. But it was a pretty controversial move. And Hideyoshi himself, he reportedly regretted it later. And then, of course, there were the invasions of Korea.
He invaded Korea.
Yeah, in the 1590s. Big, ambitious campaign, but it ultimately failed.
What happened?
Well, for one thing, Hideyoshi died in 1598. And he kind of messed things up with the succession. He had this young son, Hideyori, and he tried to make sure he would inherit everything. But it just created a lot of instability.
Okay, so Nobunaga lays the groundwork, Hideyoshi finishes it, but then things get messy again.
Pretty much. But that's where Tokugawa Ieyasu comes in. He was another one of Nobunaga's allies, and he was a survivor. He'd been through a lot, including being held hostage as a child.
Ieyasu was a hostage. That's got to be rough.
Yeah, it definitely shaped him. He learned how to, play the long game, how to wait for his moment. And after Hideyoshi died, his moment came.
So what did he do?
He basically outmaneuvered everyone else. There was a big battle, the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600.
Okay.
Ieyasu won, and that was basically it. He established the Tokugawa shogunate in Edo, which is modern-day Tokyo, in 1603.
And that's the start of the Edo period.
Right. And that period, it lasted for over 250 years.
So Ieyasu, he's the one who finally brings lasting peace to Japan.
Yeah, you could say that. He established this really strong centralized government, and he set up this whole system to, keep the daimyo in check.
How'd he do that?
Well, he made them spend every other year in Edo away from their power bases, and he controlled, all the important mines, all the major trade routes.
So he's kind of playing them against each other?
In a way, yeah. It was all about preventing anyone from getting too powerful, too ambitious.
Smart. So the Edo period, it's peacetime, right? What does that mean for the samurai?
That's a good question. That was a weird time for them. I mean, they were warriors, but there was no war to fight.
So what do they do?
Well, some of them became administrators. Others, they just lived off their stipends, kind of like retired warriors. But it led to some problems, Some samurai, they started getting restless.
Well, they missed fight.
I think some of them did. But there was also, this sense of, I don't know, a loss of purpose.
Yeah, I can see that.
And that's when you start to see this real focus on Bushido, the way of the warrior. It was like a way to redefine what it meant to be a samurai in peacetime.
Okay, so Bushido, it's about more than just fighting.
Right. It's about loyalty, honor, self-discipline, even things like frugality and proper etiquette. It was a whole moral and ethical code.
So the Edo period, it's about peace, about culture, about Bushido. And it lasts for a long time, right?
Yes, centuries. It's a really fascinating period in Japanese history.
But, of course, like all good things, it eventually came to an end.
It did.
Our book just briefly mentions the adoption of the Hinamaru flag and Kimigayo as the national anthem.
Right, right. Those became really important symbols as Japan started to modernize.
Which really kicked off with the Meiji Restoration in 1868.
Huge changes during that time. The samurai class, it was officially abolished. No more special privileges, no more carrying swords in public.
Wow, so that was the end of the samurai.
As a formal class, yeah. They lost their special status. Some of them resisted, of course. There was the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877, which was led by a samurai who refused to accept the new order. But it was put down, and that was pretty much it.
I think I've seen a movie about that. Something about The Last Samurai.
Yeah, that's the one, Tom Cruise. It's Hollywood's take on it, but it gets some of the basic ideas right.
So the samurai are gone, but their influence, it didn't just disappear, right?
Not at all. In fact, the Meiji leaders, they kind of They used the image of the samurai to create this new national identity.
How so?
They promoted Bushido, the samurai code, as the Japanese spirit. It
Yeah.
was about loyalty to the emperor, about duty, about self-sacrifice. It was a way to unite the country behind this idea of a strong, modern Japan.
So they're taking this old warrior code and kind of repurposing it.
Exactly. And it was pretty effective. They even used it to justify their expansionist policies. They fought and won wars against China and Russia, and they annexed Taiwan and Korea.
And what about Kirisuit Gomen? The book mentioned that. What's that about?
Oh, that's a bit of a dark spot in samurai history. It literally means permission to cut and leave. It was this, right, that samurai had to, kill a commoner if they felt disrespected.
Seriously.
Yeah, it was a pretty brutal system. And, of course, it was abolished during the Meiji reforms.
Good riddance.
Absolutely.
So we've got the Meiji Restoration. What comes after that?
Well, the Taisho period is next, from 1912 to 1926. It's a pretty short period, and it's kind of this this brief moment of, liberal democracy before things take a turn for the worse.
And that turn is?
The Showa period,
Yeah.
1926 to 1989. And this is where things get really, really dark.
This is World War II, right?
Yep. Ironically, Showa means enlightened peace, but it was anything but.
Yeah, that's not how I'd describe World War II.
Right. You have the invasion of Manchuria, the war in China, the expansion into Southeast Asia, the alliance with Nazi Germany and Italy, and, of course, Pearl Harbor. It was a disaster.
And that's when the U.S. drops the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Exactly. A horrific end to a horrific war.
So what happens to Japan after the war?
Well, they're occupied by the United States, and they go through this huge process of demilitarization. For a while, martial arts were banned, but they also undergo this incredible economic recovery. It's often called the Japanese economic miracle.
Right, right.
And during this time, there's this interesting thing where the samurai spirit is kind of repurposed again. This time, it's applying to the salaryman, the hardworking, dedicated company man.
So the samurai ideal is still there, but it's been, adapted to a new context.
Exactly. And it shows how powerful that ideal is, how flexible it can be.
Then we have the Heisei period, which starts in 1989.
Right. That's when the bubble economy bursts, and Japan goes through this period of economic stagnation. There are all these challenges like the aging population, the tensions with neighboring countries.
And there's even talk about revising Article 9 of the Constitution, the one that renounces war.
Yeah, that's a big one. It's been a really interesting and kind of tumultuous period for Japan.
Okay, so we've talked about the samurai through all these different periods. But what about the less traditional figures? The women warriors, the ninja, the ronin.
Right. Let's get into those.
Starting with the women warriors, because, it's easy to think of the samurai as this exclusively male thing. But our book, it makes it clear that women fought too.
Yeah, definitely. There are these legendary figures like Tomogozen and Hangaku Gozen who were known for their bravery, their skill in battle.
And there's archaeological evidence too, right?
Right. We found armor and weapons that were clearly designed for women. And even the Hagakure, which is this famous text on samurai philosophy, it mentions women warriors.
What does it say?
Well, it's kind of a grim detail, but it talks about how warriors would grow mustaches so that their heads wouldn't be mistaken for women's heads after a battle.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It implies that, women were definitely on the battlefield.
Okay, so women warriors. What about ninja? They're like the ultimate mysterious warriors, right?
Yeah, they're surrounded by so much myth and legend, but our book kind of demystifies them a bit.
How so?
Well, it explains that they originated as resistance fighters in the Iga and Koga regions. They were fighting against Oda Nobunaga, actually. And later, they were employed by figures like Tokugawa Ieyasu as spies and special operatives.
So less about supernatural powers, more about real-world skills.
Exactly. They were masters of stealth, disguise, infiltration. They used all sorts of unconventional tactics, like using scabbards as snorkels or throwing shuriken to create distractions.
Shuriken, those are the throwing stars, right?
Yeah. And they weren't really used to kill people, more like to, trip them up, give the ninja a chance to escape.
Interesting. So not quite the superhumans we see in movies?
Not really.
Okay, and then there's the ronin, the masterless samurai.
Yeah. The word literally means wave man, which is kind of poetic, right?
It is. So how did a samurai become a ronin?
There were a few ways. Their lord could die without an heir. They could be dismissed from service, or they could even just run away. And during the Edo period, there were a lot of ronin.
Why is that?
Well, Peacetime meant there were fewer opportunities for samurai to, prove themselves in battle. So some of them just ended up, like, wandering around looking for work.
So what did they do?
Some of them became teachers, bodyguards. Others, they weren't so lucky. They might have ended up as criminals or just, struggling to survive.
It's kind of sad, isn't it?
It is. But the Ronin, they represent this element of uncertainty, of instability within samurai society. They were the ones who, for whatever reason, didn't fit into the neat little boxes of the feudal system.
Okay, so we've talked about the people. What about their tools? The weapons, the armor, the castles?
Let's dive into that.
Starting with the most iconic samurai weapon, the sword.
Ah, the katana, the soul of the samurai.
Right. I mean, that's what everyone thinks of when they picture a samurai.
It's such a beautiful and deadly weapon. The way it's made, with the hard outer layer and the more flexible core, it gives it this incredible strength and flexibility.
Yeah.
And the process of making it, it's an art form in itself.
It wasn't just about slapping some metal together, right?
Not at all. It was this incredibly precise, meticulous process. And even the polishing.